a sustainable future. We designed this webinar, which for us is the high point of today's event, but with a different focus to help us have a rich and impactful conversation on the general theme of our memorial event, which is Onye, Nwanne, winning the pandemic. So our discussion this evening will explore the Igbo philosophy of Onye, Nwanne, which drives the Igbo spirit of community, collaboration, unity, and resilience. And we hope to see how we can pick up lessons from how the Biafrans applied these values COVID-19 pandemic war. And conversation today is a team of eminent scholars, who is the head of Africa program, Father Professor Nicholas Omenka, visiting professor of history, Godfrey Okoye University, Enugu. We have Dr. Ifeoma Ezedinachi, lecturer, Department of History and International Studies, Godfrey Okoye University, Enugu. This important webinar will be moderated by Nana Nwachukwu, Knowledge Management Advisor at the DFID. And we also have Mr. Patrick Okubo III, who is the chairman of CFM Board of Directors. He's in the house with us. Our hope is that conversations from this webinar will help us to decipher how the core Igbo philosophy of Onye and Nwanne could be leveraged by the world. I'm sure the entire world are joining us from on this to exit the COVID-19 pandemic. So once again, I want to say welcome. My name is Uche Nachuni. I'm the director for Center for Memories. This webinar to drive this.
Thank you very much, Uche. Hello, I can.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uche. Thank you for hosting this very important conversation. 30th of May is always a very significant day. Most of us in my generation, we remember it as the day Dimodume Ojukwu declared the Republic of Biafra. And what came after that was a mayhem, deaths, broken relationships, and a lot of things that sadly are still happening till date. I know that the theme of this conversation is to see how we can find or draw lines, parallels somehow, to see how we can find similarities, and in those similarities find solutions to the ongoing and raging pandemic. The Igbo people are known very well for their resilience, for their community spirit, and I've seen such being on display during this period as well as other periods. We have 3 people on our panel today. Our panelists will have 7 minutes each to speak specifically to the topics that I'm going to mention. Thereafter, we'll be able to take questions from the audience. I'm going to call on Professor Chidi Odinkalu to open up this conversation by talking to us about how we can draw from the Biafran spirit, the spirit in Igbo values. We say things like Ndoka, meaning that life is greater than everything. we chant Ozoemena every 30th of May. And we hold our hands to say Onye, Aghana, Nwanne, because we believe that there's a community spirit, which is why we name our sons Igwebuike. So what the conversation that Professor Chidi is going to be speaking to this evening is, how can we draw on these our principles, on these our policies, on these our ingrained and inbuilt resilience to find solutions to this pandemic, this ongoing pandemic? How can Nigeria in general learn from what the Igbos did during the war, how they survived, how they leaned on each other to win this particular ongoing pandemic? Professor Chidi, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Nana, and good afternoon, everyone, and particularly to the Center for Memories also for helping us convene this, and for giving every person of Ndibo generally and beyond, whether within Nigeria and the diaspora, the confidence to begin to grapple with these issues of memory and how we put it to use for contemporary challenges. I'm going to try and make perhaps three and a half sets of points in the 7 minutes available to me. But I can't guarantee you that I'm going to be able to cover everything from Nduka to Igwebuike and everything in between, because those are really profound issues of philosophy, and as a matter of fact, epistemics and of indeed theology, depending on how you look at it. So I'll leave that to people like Father Menka. What is underscored, however, in all of those notions is the idea that in moments of crisis, you need two things: values and leadership. Now, and those are complementary, mutually complementary. Sometimes those values don't necessarily coexist in harmony, but values are important. And those values need to be projected by leadership and protected by leadership. And that's really what we've captured in all of these aphorisms, whether it's Onye, Aghana, Nwanne or Igwebuike or Umunna Wike or Nduka. But let me also make the point, as I say this, that there can be tensions between the two. And that is really where leadership comes in. If you go back to the history of the day, 30th of May, the reality is that the cascade began much earlier. And that cascade, a major moment in that cascade was the 27th of May. On the morning of the 27th of May, 1967, General Gowon announced the creation of states. As he was announcing the creation of states, the Eastern elders who were meeting in Enugu, on that day, there was actually a meeting of Eastern elders in Enugu. When they heard that Gowon had announced the creation of states, which had been rumored, they adjourned briefly and then returned and mandated Ojukwu, who was the regional governor, to declare Biafra. Now, Ojukwu at that particular point was actually against the declaration of Biafra, but by the 30th decided and discovered he did not have a choice. That was a fateful decision. If he had come to a different decision, we would probably be talking about something different. What do I mean by this? At that point, he was living not Onye, Aghana, Nwanne as such. He was living Umunna Wike and Wike. Maybe what he needed was Onye, Aghana, Nwanne. Now, Onye, Aghana, Nwanne is a framework for immediate response to a crisis. Igwebuike is a mechanism for long-term resilience. And sometimes we don't process these notions through carefully. That in a crisis, sometimes you need a leader to face down popular voices, because that is what leadership entails. It is a very lonely furrow to plow. But that leader must have a sense of neighborliness, of neighborhood, of solidarity, of the public interest. Now, to be able to get far, you need to look after one another. But remember, ndị Igbo na-asị, otu nne na-amụ, otu uche anaghị eke. Right? So to get far, while we need to look after one another, we also need to be able to do what? To distinguish ourselves, to encourage competition. And through that, the breakouts happen, which will then look after one another. So that successful people should not forget where they come from. But that does not mean you should not go forward until Nwanne gets rogi. So it seems to me we've got also to problematize our values in the various contexts that we find ourselves. The leadership challenge we face in the Southeast today is that we've forgotten these values. Instead of Umunna wike, ma wigwe bike, we do ikeketorie. And that leads you to to mindlessness of that we see today. And instead of looking after one another, as in Onye, Aghana, Nwanne, what you have is what K.O. Mbadiwe introduced into Igbo leadership, Agada Gbachiri Ụzọ. And these notions of Agada Gbachiri Ụzọ and Ikeketorie have overtaken the notions of Umunna wike and Igwebuike and Onye, Aghana, Nwanne, which we need to rediscover. Now, my second point then builds on this, which is we've got to have a sense of time horizon. We've got to understand in Igbo epistemology, there are three people who live on earth: the dead, the living, and the unborn. And we cannot conduct ourselves in an unsustainable manner that does not protect the living or protect the claims of the unborn to the things that our ancestors have handed down to us. And this dissolute leadership that we now have in much of our Southeast, from those who buy Supreme Court judgments to elevate them from the fourth to the first, to those who rig elections and refuse to understand that they need legitimacy, which is what Umunna wike and Igwebuike teach us, there is a problem. And when you don't have popular legitimacy, you cannot fight a pandemic. Now, and that is the thing that the leadership from the 60s and 50s taught us, whether you were looking at Michael Okpara or indeed Ikemba Ojukwu, they did not acquire material things. These people are invested in material things and not in protecting people. And as I end, the third thing is this needs to be an intergenerational project, therefore. We cannot be looking at the present without looking at the future, and we cannot be looking at the present and the future without protecting innovation and the spaces that make those possible. We can return to those in the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you. You've really raised very salient issues, particularly about legitimacy and also how the new philosophies that were introduced into the society has kind of warped our sense of community. If I'm going to call on Dr. Ifeoma Ezedinachi, who will be speaking on celebrating our women. A little background. Igbo women are very strong women. And not just Igbo women, women from the South, from the Southeast, very strong women. These are women who fought in the Biafran War. Beyond fighting in the Biafran War, when the men went off to war, when they were conscripted into the Biafran army, they held fort. They held the communities together. And beyond even that, for the men who were either physically weak or emotionally weak to be conscripted, they helped hide these people. They protected not just the home front, they held their own in the society, ensured and made sure that communities had food to eat and protected their children from most of what they could of the war. I'll call on Professor Ezedinachi to give us her piece on celebrating our women. Eze Dinachi, sorry. Dr. Eze Dinachi, yes, please. Yes.
Okay. Good day all once again, and thanks for having me. I'll be making a contribution to the discussion from the perspective celebrating our women. During the Nigerian Biafran War, Igbo women were faced with challenges of which they responded to. They played great roles, which I'm about to discuss now, which range from humanitarian support to the civilians, to the fighting troops, the Biafran soldiers. They even rendered Medicare as well. In their bid to cope with the menace of hunger and unavailability of food and money, Igbo women took to economic activities such as trading, farming, and participation in local industry, all in the bid to ensure food security for their families and households. The women took care of the home front as their husbands were at the front fighting war, or even in hiding to avoid conscription. As a result, the women became the breadwinners, taking care of their families. They inherited the maintenance of their elderly relatives and the entire households. The crisis resulted in higher food crisis. The war crisis here. With the outbreak of the war, however, the farming activities now became more intensified and was dominated by Igbo women. Trading was one of the survival strategies adopted by Igbo women to survive the economic blockade being put in place on the Biafra by the federal government. They engage in two broad, in fact, I have two broad categories of trade the women engage in. There was internal trade, which was the trade within the Biafran enclave. And then the next one was the trade which Nigerian held Biafran territory, or even with Nigeria proper. That is the trade across the front lines, often called Ahia attack. Now, even when the market in the internal trade seemed unsafe because of air raid or possibilities of it, these women traders we're discussing today, the women of Biafra, took to the bush, referred to as the bush market, transacting business under tall shading trees. All this was just to evade, to make themselves not to be conspicuous before the air raids of the federal troops. In the bid to survive the hard times, the women were faced with several dangers, such as danger of being killed by bombs, strafed, or even being raped by the soldiers. I attack women traders, apart from buying, salt and other products that were needed. Some of them, in the course of that, smuggling items that were in their demands, such as tobacco, cigarettes, bathing soap, matches, among others. In fact, it was the efforts of these women, the attack traders women, that helped in salvaging Biafran economy. It helped in salvaging Biafran economy from total collapse. Other roles women played were in voluntary donations. Women contributed to war efforts through donation of food and even money to the Biafran for the upkeep of the Biafran soldiers. We must remember that at this period was the time with the as war progressed, in fact, the situation became so worsened that the Biafran government could no longer feed the soldiers. Therefore, the communities and the individuals were asked to help in order to keep the courageous Biafran soldiers at the war fronts. Igbo women, as part of their efforts to meet the food needs of these soldiers, made some donations in money and in food items. These donations were quite sacrificial, bearing in fact the fact that these women or Igbo women at this period did not even have enough for their families. The largest and most popular of women voluntary service was the cooking group. They were fondly referred to as the Biafran soldiers as the kitchen battalion. They were groups of women based in strategic locations near the war fronts who established makeshift kitchens where women formed themselves into turn in cooking for the fighting troops. Okay, even another arm of the women voluntary service in which Igbo women participated was the Biafran Red Cross. With the assistance of supplies from the International Red Cross, they provided Medicare to the casualties. The women administered first aid treatment to gunshot and shrapnel wounds from bomb explosions. All this helped to prevent infectious epidemic at the front lines. The women also extended the relief materials not just to the soldiers alone, but even to the civilian casualties. The efforts of the women Red Cross volunteers made an impact because many children and the refugees or internally displaced persons who contracted several ailments such as kwashiorkor, chickenpox, measles, would have died in the war without this Medicare. Igbo women who engage in frontline trade called ahiatag were sometimes used unofficially as spies. They informed the Biafran troops on the position of the federal soldiers. Such information was probably used to score battle victories in favor of Biafra. Also, young Igbo girls were recruited into Biafran Organization of Freedom Fighters, BOF, and trained in espionage activities. They moved in and out of Biafra held territories in search of information they could gather and transmitted it to the Biafran soldiers. Young women were enlisted in the armed forces. They were trained for active service as they performed a range of different roles such as spies, first aid technicians, and domestic laborers. However, many of the women compromise on their values and norms. We must have to address this. We must have to demonstrate this. By fraternizing, they compromise on their values and norms just to survive the war by fraternizing with the soldiers. Some resorted to such liaisons as a means to end the severe hardship they faced. But at the end of the war, these actions boomeranged when in the aftermath of the war, they were scorned and victimized. Some were even stigmatized. But nonetheless, some women were able, Igbo women were able to find alternative source of food and income, which empowered them economically.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ezedinachi. Thank you very much for this very heartwarming. Like we hear all the time, stories of wars are often told with women erased from those stories. It's very important that we chronicle and document stories of women and their participation and their efforts towards victory or towards saving humanity whenever there's a war. Our next segment is going to be taken by Reverend Father Nicholas Omenka. A little bit about these lessons that we're looking to draw, these parallel lines. Between the Biafran War, which is the biggest war, Chidi would argue with me over this, which is the biggest war Nigeria has faced till date that's recorded, and what is going on now, this COVID-19 pandemic, there are so many parallels to be drawn from it. First of all, we know that war results in food insecurity, and we can clearly see what is happening now. And this also gives rise to mistrust as a result of resource allocating from already scarce resources. And also we have access to healthcare being diminished, not just because we're at war, but we can also see that medical equipment becomes scarce, as well as the medical professionals. And now, something that's a very big similarity is the fact that we suffer death at the hands of those who are supposed to protect us, which is something that happened even during the war. So it's very, very difficult to speak about not being at war at this moment. It's very difficult for people to actually understand that we are not at war right now, because it seems like that is what is happening, which is why during the war, people often look to, when it goes to community building, community resilience, we look to religious institutions to see how they can reach smaller communities to make sure that it's not just about keeping faith, but how are you surviving? Relief efforts are usually coordinated by religious institutions because they go down to the granular base of the society. Professor Menka is going to be speaking to us about the lessons that we can draw from the role of churches and other international and local organizations who mobilized Biafra relief operations, and how we can use those lessons from then in doing our mobilizing relief operations for this pandemic response. Father, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, and thank you, everybody. Welcome, everybody. I am going to speak briefly about these lessons from the foreign relief aid for Biafra. You know, the Biafran War is generally regarded as the most horrific war in the 20th century. And that is because of the famine deaths, hunger. Of this estimated 30 million people, more than that, we don't know. The greater part of those who died because of hunger. And in fact, in the end, it is generally believed that Biafra lost the war, not because of superior power of the Nigerians, but because of hunger. Now, 50 years after that atrocious conflict, our society is faced with yet another potentially greater peril than war, the coronavirus. You know, the United States of America, the superpower of the world, lost 6,000 Americans in the Afghanistan and the Syrian war in 8 years. But that country has recorded 100,000 deaths in less than 3 months. So we are at war, and we should not be caught unprepared for such a grim prospect here in Nigeria. That is why there are valuable lessons we can learn from the foreign humanitarian intervention. I'm not going to speak actually about what Red Cross did. They were flying in from Cotonou and Fernandapo. I'm going to restrict my speech to what the churches did, the Christian churches, Christian solidarity, and coming to the aid of our distressed neighbor is enshrined in the Christian faith. You know, St. Paul had to make campaigns and collections for the church in Israel, in Jerusalem. And assistance for the needy is the crux of Christian social teaching. So it came as no surprise, therefore, that while the government prevaricated, the churches intervened with humanitarian aid. Because of diplomatic pressure and all the niceties of politics, the governments did not want to get involved. And while they did that, while they prevaricated, the Christian churches intervened. It was the missionaries inside Nigeria who, first of all, made the whole world know what was happening, because there was a total news blackout. The British and Americans didn't want to know didn't want the world to know what was happening. So the missionaries invited television crew and newspaper editors and so on. And they began to beam these horrible pictures of starving children in Europe. And the response of the Christian world to this was overwhelming. For the first time in recorded history, confessional and the national barriers were everywhere dismantled in favor of relief for Biafra. In Europe, Catholics and Protestants worked together, and in North America, Christians and Jews came together for a common cause. And the Scandinavian countries of Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden founded a consortium known as the North Church Aid. And the same thing happened in America. So these different relief organizations came together in November 1969, and formed the Joint Church Aid, the consortium that carried out the greatest airlift after the 1948 Berlin airlift. They fly more than 20 sorties a night. Huge supplies of relief materials that emanated from different parts of the globe by air, by land, and eventually we are sent by ship to the island of Sao Tome, from where they were flown by night to the Uli airport. Now, the remarkable thing about this global ensemble or intervention was it was not governmental, but a joint church aid, a revolutionary humanitarian intervention of the Christian nations without their governments. This is a very vital lesson for the Christian churches in Nigeria in the fight against the corona pandemic. You can see what how the government is facing this threat. It is the church, actually, that will do, as you rightly mentioned, that will do the right thing. Inside Biafra, JCA established feeding centers, sick bays, orphanages, agricultural ventures, and various other relief measures that mitigated the famine index and installed the genocidal intent of Biafra's adversaries. So the Christian churches should emulate these gestures, and they have the means to do so, and channels for fundraising, such as church collections. But these were the means through which the foreign airlift. The local churches should do the same and organize emergency food relief and other palliatives for the ministers and parishioners.
Thank you very much,
I read
Father.
just yesterday, Pastor Chris Oyakilome and the Catholic Bishop of Enugu areas. Then we have ecumenical collaboration. Pardon? Have I observed my 7 minutes?
Yes.
Hello? Are you hearing me?
Yes, you have.
Are you hearing me? Yes?
Yes, I can.
Are you hearing me?
Yes.
What's happening? Are you hearing me now? Okay. So,
yes,
ecumenical.
I can hear you.
Ecumenical collaboration. Are you hearing me, please?
Yes, I can hear you, sir. You've exhausted your 7 minutes.
Oh my God, no. Anyway, please, if that is the case, let me just tabulate it very strongly. Now, the church should emulate these people, and the fight against coronavirus to be effective, the churches here must unite and work together, and the youth must also be at the forefront of this fight, as the youth of Europe did, and they also have to emulate the the sacrifices the relief air pilots did. They knew the danger and still carried out their duty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you so much. We're going to have a Q&A session. We're going to take questions from people who are watching us on YouTube. We're going to curate questions from Twitter, Facebook, and the comment section for anybody who's listening in on Zoom and who wants to drop comments. Please use the comment section and drop your comments, your questions, so that we can have the panelists respond to those questions. I want to point out that having listened to the three of you, speak passionately about these issues, there's something that's been very, that's resonated with me. I've noticed that there's a society of young and old Igbo professionals who have put themselves together and have been applying some of these principles. I do understand, which I'm still going to talk or ask Chidi about, I do understand that for some reason, capitalism, fits very perfectly within Ikeke Torie, but these people who have in their line of work also decided, what, we would lean on each other and leverage on each other to be able to make sure that our communities are safe. I have someone like that who's in the group who I'm going to give 5 minutes to speak on how they have practicalized some of the points that the Reverend Father had mentioned, and also how they have put into consideration the philosophies that guide the Igbo spirit, which is Igwebuike and Onye, Nwanne. I'm going to call on Chineyembu Mbauzuku to use 5 minutes and speak on what is currently happening, what the SIP is currently doing to practicalize some of these lessons of old. I don't know, is he here?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much.
Okay, yes, please.
All right. Once again, let me quickly start by congratulating the Center for Memories for putting together this event. I think it's absolutely fantastic. It's very important that we continue to, to gather, curate, and kind of like share our memories, because ultimately it is from those memories that we can start to construct the way to go forward into the future with empathy. And that brings me to the first point, which I think is underscores almost everything that has been said by the individuals today, which is that the panelists today is that, first of all, war is a horrible thing. Nobody willingly goes to war, given the carnage that results from it. And yet we arrive at points of war out of challenges of the human spirit itself, where we start to figure out that we start to consider that perhaps we may not be able to solve the problems that we have through the process of negotiation and discussion, and giving and taking and compromising, and we end up at a point where we resort to arms as perhaps the only way to enforce our views. What this means is that when people go into the war environments, they actually go in with a human spirit that is even more heightened in its capacity to be able to drive the behaviors that we have. So sometimes you find people fighting similar to David and Goliath, who decide that, I don't have anything, but I have a spirit and I can fight this giant no matter how big it is in front of me. And it's similar to what happened in Biafra. There are many stories that have been told. It's not my point to tell that, but I want to relate that directly to what we're doing today. COVID-19, as the Father has said, is an incredible war. It's a war with an unseen enemy. It's all around us. You don't know where it's coming from, so you cannot deploy your troops. You cannot even marshal resources fast enough to be able to meet the rate at which it's spreading. And therefore, there is a call to the human spirit that is less obvious than when you're faced with the sounds of bombs dropping around you, you're seeing poverty, you're seeing starvation all around you. The physical manifestations of a war with bullets and with bombs is so horrendous that it is easier to awaken the human spirit and get it to connect to what needs to be done, to kind of like save the people who are around you and lift the communities that are around you. When COVID-19 came, we asked ourselves, what do we do? And we took our lessons directly from the Igbo spirits, the spirit that came to the fore during the Biafra War. And one of the first things that we realized was that we needed to rely almost 100% on the community, contrary to the way that our societies have evolved since 1970s. the strength of the Igbo people is not in the individual. It's in the individual, in the collective. This is really where we actually draw our strength. And this is where we draw our inspiration from. And this is what drives the human spirit that you find in Igbo communities. And so if we understood that we needed to build some kind of a framework that we awaken that spirit of Onye and encourage people to understand that it is only through Igwe that we can actually solve the problems that COVID-19 will bring along with it. And so we had to go back to try to ask ourselves, how do we take these fundamental Igbo values and link them directly to the threat of COVID-19? And we adopted more or less the same strategies that we used during Biafra. Our first emphasis was reaching a community with a message. We had to develop and craft a message, which is how we came up with the concept of Ndoka. So with Ndoka, we're able to say to people, you're facing an existential threat, which you cannot see, you cannot understand, and people are still trying to help us figure out how do we address COVID-19. But we need to understand that the first and the most important thing, which is vital to every Igbo person and to all humanity, is that life itself is precious. And that life is precious in the context of the community in which you actually live. And so locking your doors and staying within your fence and within your own house, providing yourself with rice and with all the things that you need to keep yourself going, would work counter to the requirements of meeting this crisis. And so we started a massive campaign around Ndoka, first of all, to understand that it is a life itself, and that life within the community. We link that into Onye. How do you then help those who are around you to lift up those who may be more vulnerable than yourself in the midst of the crisis? And to do that, we built out a framework. And it was really interesting what the father was saying, because our framework is very simple. We establish a single person who has convening authority within a community. And we ask that person to work with existing structures within that community at the village level. So we get in touch with the town association, we reach out to the local ecclesiastical leadership, we reach out to the women's leader, we go to the youth leaders, and we put these people together, working in consort with the guidance that's provided by the political authority to actually figure out what is needed in each community, and how can we together as a group address it. So we moved away from the individualism.
Thank you, Chime. You have just a few seconds left.
So yeah, so in essence, I think the bottom line is, it is impossible. Igbos had proven during the war and continue to prove even today. And through COVID-19, we've seen an acceleration that the strength of the community is the strength of the individual. And vice versa.
Thank you very much.
If we can carry other people along, everybody will be successful. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for sharing. If I gather, this means that SIP has created like a platform that allows leverage on existing structures. I've witnessed some of it working, and thank you for the work that you do. There's a question that has just come in. Before I ask this question, just to give it a little more context, earlier on social media, on Twitter especially today, riding on this principle of Ndoka, which means that life is precious, life is greater, there was a conversation around the erasure of Igbo language from people who moved to the cities and, to the bigger cities, maybe Kano, Lagos, and even people who moved outside the country. And even people who moved outside the country, trying to hide the accent, the Igbo accent, trying to hide their Igbo identity, largely because of a need not to be identified as Igbo, as it had become something associated with fear. This person is Igbo, then I need to fear this person. So they try to detribalize or to hide their identity to be able to fit in more. It was a survival instinct that parents sort of laid upon their children and continued in order for them to fit in and be acceptable into society. And sometimes some people gave testimonials on how when they're in Lagos, the people don't accept them, or when they're in big cities, the people don't accept them. And then when they go back into their local communities, they also don't feel accepted at the same time, because there are people who make mockery of the fact that they cannot speak the language, or they do not understand the norms and the culture. So there's a question that's asking, just giving a little bit of context to these things, saying how can Igbo leaders, wherever they are, act to protect Igbo, both in rural and urban centers? Noting specifically that the latter, which is urban centers, are usually forgotten. So I'm taking this question, I'm sending this question to the panelists. You would have about 2 minutes each to respond to this question. So I'll start with Reverend Father Omenka.
Well, thank you. The issue of leadership is very important. The Igbo society is, floating, rudderless. We have no the strategy. We're not following the strategy. Every section of Igbo land does its own thing. There is no pan-Igbo discussion group. And there is no person to bring them together. Look at our Ohanese in Igbo. I think this is an area, a God-given opportunity to bring the Igbos together. And let me tell you honestly, I don't know what they're doing. They should make their presence known in every locality, not just when there is a meeting, they meet. When there is no meeting, you don't hear about them again. That is one area where we can provide leadership and come together to discuss these problems you just mentioned. Ohanese and Igbo should do that. And I frown at the situation where in every city in this country, you have Eze and Igbo. Does that help us, or does it, in fact, minimize the whole idea of Igbo solidarity? That's what I can say about this.
Thank you very much. Let me have Dr. Ezedinachi respond to this. What's your opinion? I would also like you to, I try to shy away from this thing of asking women to respond to women issues specifically, but I understand that you're a scholar in this aspect. Also, how do you think that in addition to acting to protect Igbo in rural and urban centers, beyond that, how can it be something that we look into some of the cultures, some of the norms that are very harmful, to women? As we're saying, no more with Ozoemena, the same thing, women are crying out, about a lot of things that our society has embodied for them. So please, if you can give us your thoughts.
Okay, thank you. There's always an Igbo adage. There's an Igbo adage that says, Onye na-amara ebe mmiri bido mabia, ama ebe mmiri kwụsị. In other words, if you don't know when rain started falling on you, you won't be able to know when it stopped or where it stopped, at what point where you were did the rain stop. So what am I trying to say? If we decide to forget our Igbo culture, let me come to where it concerns women. Women decide not to imbibe the culture, especially of speaking Igbo language, allowing their children to speak Igbo language. Women decide to neglect it or allow it, disregard it, then we'll have a I would suggest we first of all start from the home before we talk about the leadership. The women should be encouraged in families. They should be encouraged to train their children in the Igbo language. It's not like, no, don't speak Igbo to my children. Please, I want them to understand English first. When they grow up, so long as they're in this environment, in Nigeria, in Igbo environment, they will learn Igbo. No. Women should be encouraged to imbibe the idea of teaching their children Igbo language. This is where it concerns women and family. Now, where it concerns the leadership, I suggest that the leaders should inculcate Igbo language in the curriculum in the manner that you have to have at least a credit in Igbo language among the papers that are required for you to get admission. If it's in non-speaking Igbo, then you are allowed. Let it be inculcated in the curriculum that you must have a credit in one of the languages. Then those who are of Igbo origin will have no choice than to read Igbo, understand Igbo, write Igbo, and pass Igbo in their SS3 before gaining admission into the university. Because I've come to notice that, yes, these students, they are being taught Igbo in primary school and secondary school, but when they get to senior secondary school, it is now being made optional. So you see some students not paying attention to it. But when they know that the same way you are required to pass mathematics and English, most especially English before gaining admission into the higher institutions, that Igbo language, if you are an Igbo person, you should be able to understand Igbo, write Igbo, and pass Igbo before gaining admission. I think it will go a long way in making us imbibe Igbo language and Igbo culture, because in the course of studying that language, we will be able to get acquainted, the children will get acquainted with the culture and what's required of it, or what is required of them to know as far as the language is concerned. That is my own view.
Thank you, Dr. Isejinachi. Professor Dinkalu, what I would want to ask you, do you think there is a scarcity of leadership, a scarcity of Igbo leadership in the urban centers? If you think so, what do you think may be a possible solution? And also, before the solution, why do you think this is so? And what do you think is a possible solution?
Well, thank you very much, Nana. First, I asked the question, who's a leader? And the answer that I prefer is look in the mirror. I think, we're so used to outsourcing these things that we're looking for God's sake, what makes Dr. Bazin Umahi a better leader than you are? Because he rigged an election and got into office and he's messing around and telling us that coronavirus will not get to Abia State because Abia State is the state of God. I could get very angry speaking about this stuff. But I think every one of us in this particular conversation has got to see ourselves as a leader. And that's the point that Chineye makes, that we cannot continue to outsource leadership and think that we are doing ourselves any favors. Nana, you probably followed the conversation about 3 weeks ago when, what's her name, from Kaduna, posted up on Twitter that there was no, that Igbo land had too much palliative, ndikato, that there was palliative everywhere in Igbo land because, it was being supplied by everybody. And I really had to take her up and say, look, you see, the Igbo mentality does not deal well with the idea of palliative because palliative is a mentality of dependency. The reason every one of us invests in this particular situation in making sure that everybody in our respective extended families is well fed is because palliative is not part of our mentality. Okay? Now, in those parts of Nigeria where government works for them, palliative is their mentality. Palliative, that is why every one of us here is a leader. So there are political leaders, economic leaders, civic leaders, intellectual leaders, faith leaders, and that's the way, women leaders, that is youth leaders. That's the way we structure ourselves. That's the nature of the age grade system, and that's the nature of our Republican system, and long may that succeed. I therefore don't quite agree with the narrative of erasure of Igbo language. In Boston, there are Igbos teaching Igbo language. Leadership is also about making use of, in London, there are Igbos teaching Igbo language to children. It's about making use of the facilities we've got. Sugar Belly, Lotanna, Odunze. Lotanna is providing packages, portable packages in Igbo language lessons. And I'm making it available to lots of kids from everywhere in Igbo land, diaspora and at home. Lots of us should do that and stop complaining about how people are erasing us. Nobody is erasing us. I'm sorry about that. I went to Buniyadi. Igbos were teaching one another Buniyadi. They refused to come back to Ali Igbo. You saw that woman in Maiduguri, whom the governor gave money from his pocket there. That woman has lived there for 31 years. She's not come back. The mentality we've got is that Igbos live in a particular space. And we make those who don't live in that particular geopolitical space sound expendable. We have a vast diaspora, and we've got to think in terms that allocate space in our world to our diaspora as well as our insporas everywhere. And let me end on one more note, one suggestion. If we are going to protect Igbos everywhere, we've got to make sure that we don't just make our people study Igbo. We've got to be experts in our enemies, in those who don't wish us well and those whom we don't think like us. How many Igbos have done dissertations on Fulani society and how it's organized? Ndị be anyị na-asị na onye ndị iro gbara gburugburu na-eche ndụ ya nche oge niile. Iche ndụ gị nche oge niile ewu gịnị? Ịmara ka ndị ahụ gbara gị gburugburu, ndị iro niile ahụ mere gịnị si ahazi onwe ha. We must not just know Igbo. We must also know those who don't wish us well. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It appears Nana might have lost connection. So let me jump in here and kind of moderate a little bit. I'd like to explore this a bit. Part of the challenges we have in Nigeria is that we do not have a nation. We might have a country, but we don't have a nation. Now, should an effort be made to teach the Biafran history as a way of building this more united nation, or this more united Nigeria, where everyone finds space to exist? I wonder if, Chidi, you want to take that on for a second before I go to Father Omenka, who I can't see online. Chidi.
Can you take that again, Patrick, please?
My question is there value in pushing for the Biafran history to be taught in schools, in Nigerian schools all over, as a way of building a more united Nigeria?
Yeah, I asked you to take that again because I wanted to get my thoughts together. There are two dimensions to that question. One is the question on unity, and the other is on history. And so I segment the question. Now, on history, absolutely, yes, I totally agree. But not necessarily for the functionality that you suggest. Now, if you look at, because I do think that memory is essential for constructing identity, and identity is central to being able to have personality that is assertive, that is able to discover its mission in life. And therefore, that if we are able to recover this memory through history, we'll stand a better chance. Now, that entails that we teach it. If you look at Nigeria's narrative, it ends in 1966 and continues from 1970. That's nearly 4 years, over 3 years of national life wiped out. Now, and those 3 years changed Nigeria's history in absolute trajectory in every way possible. That means that we are not able to deal with our present in the way that we should. So I do think completely that we should address that gap. But as I said, it's not because of the functionality that you suggest of national unity. I don't believe in national unity. Let me make that very clear. Unity for its own sake has no purpose and serves no purpose. No country in the world is united, but there are values that underpin coexistence. Values of respect for human life, Nduka, values of dignity, values of labor, the significance and importance of labor and hard work. Now, those values for me are, and then the pacific resolution of disputes, institutions that work. If we underpin those values and teach them to everybody, people will coexist in Nigeria. But when we tell people you should be united and those values don't exist, there will never be any unity. And that's why the country is subverted, because the people who should underwrite those values don't believe in them. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so Nana, I posed a question before you came on board, but let me push it to Father Menka and then back the microphones. Father Menka, what's a question?
Okay.
And how do we
sorry
begin
about
to
that
build
timeout.
this broad, that could then lead to unity, in Nigeria? Father Menka.
Father, please. My video just stopped while you're asking the question.
Okay, so my question, identity remains a big challenge for us in constructing a nation that works for everybody in Nigeria. Chidi has taken a slightly different tangent to that question, and I wonder if you have, your own ideas on what we should be doing with history to build a nation that works for everybody.
Well, I think I should begin with this whole thing about idea. I mean, about language. I was a bit surprised that Professor Chidi doesn't see it as something necessary for a nation. If the cultural block is held together by this idea of having a common heritage, and the first in that is the language. What Dr. Ezechina said is very relative. If you cannot speak the language, if the parents insist that their children will learn English first, then we are doing not a good service to our nationality. If you watch the nations that have made it, Indonesia, China, and the rest of them, language. If you teach mathematics in Igbo, I think everybody here will understand mathematics. So that is okay. Then secondly, I don't think that the Igbos have this sense of nationality. The moment we begin to think, and the only way we can do that is not forget our history. We must go back to study our history, how we became a nation, how we became relevant in Nigeria. All these things are important. And the moment we become national conscious in ourselves, then we have no problem. And history is a very big medium to doing that. So,
thank you very much. Hello?
Yes?
Hello? Okay, Father. Thank you very much. I was just putting you on notice that you have exceeded my allotted time. Just a quick one. We have Reverend Richard Fee. Reverend Richard Fee is from the Presbyterian Church of Canada. I wanted to see if he can take 3 minutes only actually, to share his thoughts on the international support that churches rendered to during the Biafran War and how it impacted on the current Igbo society that we have now. If he can take 3 minutes out of his time to share his thoughts before I take one question and then we can round up.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, okay, I can.
Okay, I'll be very, very brief. I want to start by saying that the Toronto School Board has Igbo as one of the languages that you can write an exam for and qualify and get a credit for in your high school diploma. That's in Canada. So the encouragement of languages from outside of the boundaries of Canada is strongly encouraged. So I appreciate it. I've got 2 Igbo grandchildren and they are not learning Igbo, which vexes me. But anyway, that's a sideline. My interest recently commenced about 3 years ago, and I was asked to provide some information and contacts to somebody who was wanting to make a film on Can Air Relief, which was the Canadian effort of the churches to buy airplanes. They ultimately bought 5 super constellations and flew from Sao Tome into Biafra. The contribution during 1969 up to the last flight, January 15th, 1970, was phenomenal. And I've done all the statistics. I've collected material now from Canada, from the Netherlands, from Scotland, and the US, pulling all together the information. I've also got films that I collected from Denmark and Canada, outlining what Canada had done during the war. Why is this important? I am convinced that this is one of the greatest contributions Canada ever made to the world scene. It was Biafra that made Canada as a nation of contributing humanitarians. The material that I've collected has amazing stories of the people who were involved. I also very miraculously discovered the last living pilot who flew those flights into Biafra. He's 86 years old, still very sharp, and I've interviewed him. I also met the chief of operations on Sao Tome, who lives in Vancouver. His information is priceless. What else did this war give to the humanitarian and the world community? That is a lesson which I do not want to see lost. And I pray that we will finish our film here in Canada, because even though the war was horrendous, up to 2 million people died, the world did learn some very important lessons. All of the United Nations standards of treatment of refugees, provision of humanitarian aid are all based on Biafra, what was learned during that war. Médecins Sans Frontières and about 4 other organizations grew out of the Biafran War. They're still active today. The sphere standards of humanitarian organizations all came out of the Biafran experience. This is a sideline, but it should never be forgotten what the suffering that was driven onto people, what good did ultimately come out of that. It was horrendous, but the world did learn a few lessons. And I, for one, want to be one person who makes sure that those lessons are not forgotten. Is that my 3 minutes?
Yes, that's your 3 minutes. I'm glad you cut the cue. Yes, that's your 3 minutes. It's very interesting hearing some of these things that that kind of gets written out of history books. These stories must be told. Hearing about MSF, the sphere standards, I know a lot of organizations, CSOs, you know, that have root in the Biafran War. It's important to see that they continue to do the work that they do. There's a question that's been asked so many times. You know, I've seen this question, it's still being repeated as I speak. When we talk about the Biafran War, and when we talk about Igbo people, you know, we speak so much about erasure, but at the same time, there are a lot of minority tribes that fought alongside the Igbos in this Biafran War. A lot of them also do not feel that sufficient credit is given, you know, to the fight that they fought emotionally, physically, spiritually, in losing their homes. We've had the Anyoma people, we had, you know, who often talk about the Asaba massacre. We have people from places like Boki, you know, in Cross River. So there's so many stories. We have the Jaws. There's a question. This question here goes, it says, can someone say something? Can anyone say something about the significance and the role, the significance and the role of non-Igbos in this Biafran War narrative? I'm going to hand this over to Reverend Father Omenka to speak for 2 or 3 minutes, actually, because I'm trying to round up. and also to Chidi to speak for 2 minutes on this issue.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the reason behind their feeling or this so-called neglect, it's not because of us. Somebody mentioned in this discussion, many people after the war, especially these minorities you mentioned, they tried to disassociate themselves with the Igbos. They didn't want to feel that they're a part of Igbos. I think that's where the problem came from. That you don't want to, let me give you an example. There is a good friend of mine. We studied together in Regensburg. He's from Umuatrueche. But right in my presence, he said he doesn't belong to Biafra. A chair we are given is in a river state, but that does not make him an Igbo. He's an Igbo. So they are the cause of their neglect. If they come out like they're doing now in Okrika, if you have heard it, Okrika people now are revolting that say they don't belong to any other group except Biafra. So if we have such a association with Biafra from these people, I don't think that we have any reason to complain that they are not being, that their sufferings and the rest of them are not being recognized. They should ask themselves the question, why? It's not from us. Everybody wants to dissociate himself from Biafra. I think that is all I can say about that. 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Chidi, you have 2 minutes, please.
Okay, thanks a lot, Nana. Just 2-3 points. First of all, as you probably know, the war effectively, the cascade effectively began with state creation and was bookended by abandoned properties. And both of which had consequences for some of these issues that you refer to, but particularly state creation, because it was deliberately designed by the Nigerian side with the assistance of the United Kingdom to ensure that the Southeast or the Eastern region lost a lot of things. One, that it lost supply lines. Two, that's the Biafra lost supply lines, but it also lost petroleum, lost maritime territory, and lost support of the Eastern minorities. So that was a deliberate policy of government. I don't think it necessarily came from the communities, because when you look at the communities, look, the biggest voice and the biggest thing that held the Biafran identity together during the war was Okonkondem. Okonkondem was not Igbo. The person who handed over the instrument of surrender in 1970 was Philip Effiong, General Effiong. He was not Igbo. The first place that was attacked was Gakem. Gakem was not Igbo. And I do think that that was on the 7th of July. I do think that it's 1967. It's important for us to understand the narratives and the history to be able to make the narrative consistent and faithful. And that's why the history is necessary. Teaching it is necessary. Researching is necessary. Affirming it is important. And I do think the point about acknowledging the sufferings of every community is useful. Let me end on this note. If you listen to El Rufai's son in this latest Twitter spat about rape, he called somebody from Cross River State Igbo and abused him and he wanted to rape that boy's mother. Because to a lot of these people, anybody who is from below the Niger is Igbo. It's immaterial what your ethnic identity is. And I think we've got to also be alive to that larger sense, that larger bigotry that defines the Nigerian context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chidi. I have a few thoughts, I would say that more often than not, maybe this is one of the outcomes of the war. There's, as far as most Nigerians are concerned, except the very, 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 very extremely enlightened ones, there's just the North and the South. So it goes both ways, actually. There's a lot of confusion as to you're either Igbo or you're Hausa. Sometimes, even the Yorubas get a little bit confused, in the mix. One of the things I want to ask my own question, I want to ask my own question, and this question is going to go to Dr. Ezedinachi, particularly on the issue of erasure of the Igbo language. One of the arguments that's been made is the same that you have consistently made throughout this conversation on inclusion of Igbo language as a compulsory, language, subject. However, one thing I want to ask is this: what is the commercial value of the Igbo language? In the sense that we've had these conversations, particularly people of my generation, we have these conversations every now and then. What is the viability of the language? What are we actively doing to develop the language? Because languages borrow words, they lean on each other. The English language largely leans on the French, French leaning on the Spanish. There's a whole development, there's a whole phase, that language passes through. What are we doing actively to put scientific words into Igbo language, to put words that are used in studies in Igbo language? We make mention of countries that have developed their language deliberately and actively. When we cite examples, languages that are not being used for trade, languages that are not being used for science will be erased. This is my opinion. However, I'm wondering if you look at it in that, context, I would like you to answer that question, but hold that thought, Then back to Father Omenka, on the issue of the minorities, the people who fought alongside the people of Biafra, on the issue of them not wanting to be recognized, as Biafrans, of taking of taking the what you consider the easy way out, or not wanting to align with Biafra. I do not believe that is totally the situation. I don't think that's the situation as it is. A lot of these people, like Philip Effiong, who is whose father fought in the Biafran War. We know his role. History has not written him out of the books yet. He's been raising issues, in the chat room. He's the one who asked this question. And there's a way it sounds when you suggest that these people do not want to be Igbos. Initially, when I was talking about the erasure of the language, even Igbo people at some point do not want to be Igbo people, because it connotes something, more of pain, more of, if we identify this way, they will think we're troublesome. Just like what is happening, across the world with Black people who somehow try to fit into a particular culture that's expected of them, which is what I think happens in such situations. So I'm not so sure that it is as a result of not wanting to align, wanting to do. I see that we are maybe without intending to also erasing them from this conversation. So Dr. Ezedinachi, please, if you can address the question I raised, then I would like to give the floor for 3 minutes to Philip Effiong to speak on the issue of the Southern minorities.
Okay, thank you. Like I said earlier on, that there is need for us to encourage Igbo language, not just at home, but even in the school, that Igbo language should be incorporated in the curriculum from primary school, nursery, primary to secondary school. You know, now you asked a question about language value. Igbo language cannot have that language value. It's only when we speak it and make it a kind of link, in fact, a lingua franca within Igbo land here and even outside Igbo land. You go to an offices, go to ministries, you want to procure a job within Igbo, within our Igbo environment here. One of the criteria should be, oh, you're an Igbo, okay, and you need to write an aptitude test. Write this aptitude test in Igbo before you write the one in English. When we continue doing it this way, you see the Igbo language will begin to develop. It's continuous practice, abiding by this Igbo language. As I said earlier, when we speak this language, when this language is being taught, then the culture, the tradition of Igbo will be taught as well. And when we get conversant with it, that joy, that love for our culture, whom we are. If you don't know whom you are, you will not, you can't even move forward without knowing where you're from. So when we cultivate that habit of learning how to speak Igbo, speaking Igbo to our children at home, the children learning Igbo in school, writing Igbo even as a compulsory subject for them to gain admission, going for an interview to procure a job, then probably Igbo language will be part of the language you will be asked to write, not just English. Then you begin to see Igbo language developing. Then the Igbo culture, Igbo language value you're asking about now begin to grow. That when you see your fellow Igbo man, even in diaspora, you can speak Igbo together and they unite. That unity, that Onye and Nwanne team that we're discussing about now will grow. They said a thousand miles. A thousand miles.
Thank you very much. I'm going to yield the floor to Philip F. Young Jr. To speak for 3 minutes. But what I would like that conversation to be about, so that we don't lose track of what we're talking about, the southern minorities, I would like for him to draw parallels from that and what we can leverage on this to try to restructure, even in inclusion. When we're talking about solving the problem of the pandemic, where does inclusion come to play? Leveraging on lessons from the southern minorities during the Biafra War. Mr. Ifeon, please.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? I just want to make sure.
Yes, I can hear you.
It's a lot you're asking me to say in 3 minutes, but I just want to say one of the things that people want to do is continue to put a wedge between us. Someone already mentioned the women's revolution that took place in 1929. It was all across the Eastern region. My own grandmother, who is an Ibibio woman, participated in that revolution. We've been like that. We should remember that one of the propagandas used by the Nigerian side was to try and create those, put a wedge between us and create rifts, and it's working. I don't need to be Igbo or identify with Igbo to be Biafran. The cause was bigger than that. What people want to try to do is create this notion that these stubborn Igbo people, these domineering Igbo people just wanted to separate and carry other minorities along with them, which is absolutely false. Unfortunately, many of us minorities have bought into that narrative, and many Igbos as well. And I do respect the fact that, like the Reverend said, there are people who, for self-preservation, have tried to deny their participation or their being Biafran. Also, I do respect the fact that the Igbos were the prime victims of that war and are mainly the people that have chosen to keep this narrative alive. Many of us have chosen not to make it our business. That said, many of us are passionate about Biafra. I always tell people, honestly, I don't feel as welcome in Nigeria as I was in Biafra. And no matter what, whether it exists again or not, I'll never abandon the Biafran spirit, and I'll never deny it. And I've made enemies for that reason, and I don't care. The truth is that many of us, although you use the term minority, I'd rather not use that. Minorities in terms of numbers, but our role was major. Everything from the Afia attack that you talk about, Okokondem, as you mentioned, there were 2 generals that were from the present Cross River Southeastern area. Even the person who came up with the name Biafra, Chief Opigo, he wasn't an Igbo man. So let's not allow ourselves, even though we want to be, even though we want to recognize that the prime target and victims and those who suffered the most were Igbos, let's not allow people to try and split us and put us into different compartments. Many of us may deny, many of us are not denying, that's the truth. And many of us are passionate about having gone through that experience. We want to keep the story alive, and we were extremely involved in a very major and significant way. Both the fighting force, the leadership. I think one of the women who even commanded the platoon was an Efik woman. So my point is not to necessarily say, oh, it's wrong to come out and emphasize the significance, but to recognize the fact that we need to broaden the conversation the same way Former has talked quite eloquently about women who are usually marginalized. Let's not marginalize anyone, and let's make it as comprehensive as possible so that we don't tell an incomplete story. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution. One of the things that stands out for me from what you have said is how important it is, even in a humanitarian story or a human interest story, to pull together all angles of that story for it to be complete and rounded. Even so, as we are in a medical war front, with COVID-19, it's important that we also do not erase the stories of people like the hospital cleaners, the ones that take the biggest beatings, who are often not recognized. How are we remembering to include, like he said, not minority in terms of support or in terms of effort, but minority in terms of number, in terms of, what they do. It's important that we draw some of those parallels to see the people that normally would try to write out of history, but who play a huge role in ensuring that some of these battles are won. I want to thank everyone for their contributions so far and yield the floor to Mr. Patrick Okibo to give us our closing remarks and vote of thanks. Thank you to everyone who has contributed in one way or the other. YouTube conversations. I see the conversations around what the Igbos are doing for 2023. Those questions, I'm sure you can meet them one-on-one and have that conversation. So please, Mr. Okibo.
Thank you very much, everyone who's joined. Can you hear me? I believe so. I just want to take a few minutes to thank everyone who's made today possible. I mean, we've been at this celebrating, today since 8 o'clock, and it's now about 6:30, and a lot of people made this possible. First of all, I'd like to thank the panelists, who made time to join this conversation this evening. I'd also like to thank, in a very special way, the Society of Igbo Professionals for working with us in putting together, the series of activities we had today, and most importantly, for spreading the word using their all the members and the various channels available. Also want to thank in a special way Ed Emeka Kazo, Ezen Nugonabo Nobosi, for what he's been doing for us at the center. Earlier on in the day, we showed a documentary that he worked on free of charge over 4 to 5 months to deliver for Ndibo. Thank you so much for that effort. And to all those who continue to help us out at the center, the volunteers, the staff, other board members, and our patrons who continue to do what I consider olu obodo, which is really olu akwụgwọ in the sense of akwụgwọ, but very important work as well. And for all those who contribute, donate to the center, the monies you send to us, the books, the items, everything you contribute to the center, we really appreciate. That's what makes it possible for us to continue to do the work we do. So on that note, I thank everyone who's joined us throughout the journey that we've had today, to commemorate the 53rd anniversary of the Republic of Biafra. We'll be back at it again next year. And we hope that as we continue to keep this message alive, that the labors of our heroes past, would not have been in vain. And on that note, I say, thank you very much for all your support. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chidi. Thank you, Fadomenka. Thank you, Forma. Thank you, Nana. Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yagazie.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.